Today, we are ranking every major service pistol and revolver of the Second World War. We will go from the absolute worst battlefield liabilities to the undisputed kings of combat. Let's begin the countdown. Kicking off our list at number 35 is the United States FP-45 Liberator. This was a stamped sheet metal box dropped to resistance fighters. It was a smooth-bore single-shot weapon that lacked any real accuracy. The loading process was incredibly slow and clumsy under pressure. It literally took longer to reload this gun than it took to manufacture it. It was a psychological tool rather than a true combat pistol. Next up is the Japanese Type 94 Nambu. This is widely considered the most dangerous pistol for the user to carry. It featured an exposed sear bar on the left side of the frame. If you bumped it against your gear, the gun would immediately fire. You never even had to touch the trigger to cause an accidental discharge. It was a disastrous flaw for a military sidearm. Moving on to the Italian Glasanti Model 1910. This pistol was originally chambered in the weak 9mm Glasanti cartridge. The fatal flaw was its magazine dimensions, which accepted standard 9mm parabellum ammo perfectly. Firing that hotter ammunition would finally tear the weak receiver apart. This catastrophic failure made it a deadly trap for uninformed soldiers. It was eventually replaced by much safer Italian designs. Next is the Japanese Type 26 revolver. This was a total relic from the 19th century still seeing combat. It featured a grueling double-actionally trigger pull that exhausted the shooter. It also had an incredibly weak cylinder lockup that spun freely when decocked. These massive flaws destroyed any chance of accuracy in a frantic firefight. It was hopelessly outgunned by modern semi-automatic pistols. Let's look at the Czechoslovakian CZVZ-38. This was an overly bulky and heavy double-action only pistol. It was chambered in a relatively weak 380 ACP cartridge. German troops were often forced to carry it as a substitute weapon. They universally disliked it due to its terrible, clunky ergonomics. The incredibly stiff trigger pull made hitting a target very difficult. Coming in next is the Italian Bodo Model 1889. This was a rugged but utterly obsolete revolver design. It originally dated all the way back to the black powder era. Somehow it was still seeing frontline combat in the early 1940s. It featured a folding trigger on certain models that was awkward to deploy. It was completely outclassed by the weapons of the Allied forces. Next up is the Soviet Kovantike. This was a tiny pocket pistol meant purely for civilians and staff officers. It fired an extremely underpowered 6.35mm cartridge. The weapon was completely useless for actual frontline combat against enemy troops. It could never reliably stop a charging soldier in thick winter clothing. It was strictly a badge of authority rather than a combat tool. Moving down the list is the French Ruby pistol. These were cheap Spanish blowback pistols produced in massive numbers for World War I. They were pulled out of storage to fight in the Second World War. They suffered from completely terrible and inconsistent manufacturing tolerances. A magazine from one Ruby pistol often would not fit inside another. This made field maintenance an absolute nightmare for French soldiers. Next, we have the British Enfield No. 2 Mark I. Specifically, we are looking at the notorious tank crew variant. It had its hammer spur completely removed to prevent snagging inside tight armor compartments. This modification forced the gun to operate as double action only. That heavy trigger pull made it nearly impossible to shoot accurately under extreme stress. It was a compromise that severely hurt combat performance. Next is the Soviet Nagin M1895. This revolver is highly famous for its unique gas seal cylinder. This rare feature meant it could actually be effectively fitted with a silencer. However, its general combat effectiveness was ruined by an agonizingly slow loading gait. It also required a massive 20 pounds trigger pull to fire in double action. Unloading empty casings one by one was lethal in a fast firefight. Let's continue with the Japanese Type 14 Nambu. This was the standard Japanese officer sidearm throughout the entire war. It suffered from a highly brittle firing pin that broke very often. It also had terrible magazine retention issues when the release button was bumped. Finally, it relied on the incredibly weak 8mm and Mambo cartridge. It was a highly flawed weapon that failed to meet military standards. Next up is the French Mayball DD. This was a functional but entirely unexceptional blowback pistol. It was chambered in the small 32 ACP caliber. It worked reliably enough in the field for police and security forces. However, it severely lacked the stopping power needed for heavy military use. It was quickly overshadowed by more powerful handguns of the era. Moving on to the Belgian FN model 1910-22. This was a very reliable John Browning striker fire design. It was widely issued to various European police and military forces, but it featured virtually non-existent iron sights that hindered aiming. It was also chambered for very weak ammunition types like 32 ACP. It functioned well but was far too weak for the main battlefields. Next is the Hungarian FG-37M. This was a very sturdy and exceptionally well-built weapon. It proved to be highly reliable in muddy and dirty conditions, but it was still relegated to the underpowered 380 ACP round. This specific caliber made it far too weak for dedicated military combat against riflemen. It was an excellent design held back by its ammunition. Let's look at the Czechoslovakian CZ Viso 27. This was a beautifully machined and incredibly simple blowback pistol. It was widely utilized by German police forces after the occupation. Rear echelon troops also carried it heavily throughout the entire war. It was highly dependable and easy to maintain in the field, but just like many others, it lacked real knockdown power. Next up is the United States Colt M1903 Pocket Hammerless. It was extremely sleek, completely snag-free, and highly concealable. It became highly beloved by Allied generals as a personal defense weapon. General George Patton famously carried one with ivory grips. However, it fired a weak caliber that was totally unsuited for infantry combat. It completely lacked the stopping power needed for actual trench clearing. Coming in next is the Italian Beretta M1934 and M1935. These compact pistols were virtually jam-proof in harsh desert conditions. This incredible reliability came directly from their signature open slide design, but they were significantly held back in combat by a low 7-round capacity. They also fired very weak calibers that struggled to stop threats instantly. They were beautiful guns, but underpowered for global warfare. Next we have the French model 1935A and 1935S. These pistols featured phenomenal ergonomics and great mechanical accuracy. They were an absolute joy to shoot on the training range. Sadly, the French military totally crippled their combat potential. They specifically chambered them in the weak 7.65mm longer round. A better caliber would have made them top-tier combat handguns. Let's continue with the German Mauser HSC. This was a highly advanced double-action pocket pistol designed to compete with Walther. It looked incredibly sleek and modern for its time. However, its unique shrouded hammer design was a major tactical flaw. It made the gun very susceptible to trapping dirt and mud on the battlefield. It was a brilliant civilian gun that struggled in military service. Next is the German Sauer 38H. This pistol featured a brilliant concealed internal hammer design. It also had an advanced cocking and co-cocking lever on the frame. It was truly ahead of its time for handgun safety technology, but the internal parts were simply too complex and delicate for harsh battlefield conditions. When it got dirty, it was prone to highly complicated malfunctions. If you want to see more historical loadouts and deep dives, make sure to subscribe. Let us know in the comments which sidearm you would trust with your sync to video time.